All right, so let's get moving, especially given all the schedule fun today. So this is testing your style guide and theme in Drupal 8. Hopefully you're in the right spot. Thanks for coming. So I am Brian Perry. That's where you can find me on Twitter and Drupal.org. I work for a company called Breakthrough Technologies in Evanston, Illinois. So bit of a haul to get out here, but I used to live in the area, so I love coming by whenever I can. And I also happened upon free Red Sox tickets for last night, so that gives a bonus, although they lost in the 9th inning. So not the best. And the slides are available at that URL there if you want to look at them. So yeah, also if I am a little bit slow on the uptake during this talk, it's because I was at the Red Sox game last night. Here is a photo of me enjoying the Red Sox game. Okay, so infomercial moment. Has this ever happened to you? It took a while to find just the right infomercial fail GIF because there are so many good ones. The other one that I debated about using, there's a guy that has in one hand a bowl of chips, another hand a soda, and he tries to pick up a remote control and drops them both. Another good one, worth checking out. But has this ever happened to you? One tiny CSS change causes a regression deep in the outer reaches of your site. And it's tough to track down. Who knows how long it lives? Not a good thing. So in infomercial style, it's time to stop the madness. So this is an example of a screenshot comparison diff from a visual regression test. So you'll see that there's a baseline image of a component on your site, a screenshot of the change, and then on the right you see a diff of the before and after overlaid on top of each other so you can see what the change is. So what we're going to be working towards in this session is getting to the place where we can perform these types of tests on our theme and our style guide and have a useful framework to protect us from those types of regressions. So you certainly could just fire up one of those tools to do that sort of screenshot comparison. But in my opinion, it's useful and very important to have kind of a framework that leads up to that. So that's what we're going to be working through. So the short story, hang in there. It's going to take us a little bit to get to that piece. But I think that everything that leads into it can help also make you build a better theme and protect you from these types of regressions as well. So part of the story here is just style guide driven development in general as a practice. So as opposed to when I've given this talk before, I think this audience is probably a little more hip to this topic, but we'll just go through some things at a high level here. So style guide driven development is the decoupling of front end and back end development so that you can, for example, build out portions of your theme and components on your site, how they're going to be visually represented before that functionality actually exists. So one of the wonderful things about that is that theming doesn't have to come last as you're building your Drupal site. I don't know if you guys have experienced this same sort of thing, but I've definitely been in positions where the expectation is that there's a phase towards the end where you can just clean everything up and make it look pretty, and that never, ever works all that well. So this, for example, is the perception of what that looks like. Right at the very end, you can finish the theming, make everything look pretty. You cross the finish line with your double metal signs, and everything's great. And in reality, it's a lot closer to this, where some things are going to get done, other things aren't going to look quite like you intended. Some people are going to get hurt, and there'll be a guy just kind of leaning on a hurdle in the background. I didn't notice that until I had used this a couple times. I'm like, look at that guy. Or there's the Mario Kart version where you're going to be right at the finish line and you'll be hit by a blue shell just at the last minute. That's a reference that usually works for like 2 or 3 people, probably the guy with the Zelda laptop. But it's worth it every time. You win the award for having a Zelda laptop when I use that slide. So another piece of this framework is the idea of a living style guide. Which, again, I wouldn't be surprised if a number of people in this room have experience with or are familiar with. But this is a screenshot of an example of a living style guide. This is the US Web Design Standards. So you'll see that there's a number of sections on the left-hand side for different components and different guidelines. There's descriptions about visual style and typography here. This is a screenshot of a search bar component. So here we have a description of what the search bar is. And you'd see different variations on the search bar, big, medium, small. And then below, snippets of markup that you can use. And the idea here is that if you render this markup, it should look like that search bar. So things that make a living style guide or a good living style guide, excuse me. One is that it's modular and reusable. Atomic design, I guess just to also, because we're tight on time with the schedule changes and stuff, who is familiar with atomic design and that concept in general? Most people, so I won't go too deep into this. But this is Brad Frost's post on atomic design. That quote up at the top was something that has really clicked with me and always sticks in my head, the idea that we're not designing pages, we're designing systems of components. So this is an image that kind of lays out the individual pieces of the atomic design theory. And from my perspective, it's not necessarily as important what you call these things and the exact approach that you follow. But what is most important is that you're trying to build things out in a way that you have pieces that are reusable and modular. And the other big important piece of it is that last bit with templates versus pages. So a template is basically just a unique layout of those organisms and molecules put together. It's not an individual page. So I'm sure everybody here has also experienced getting a Photoshop mock-up of a page, and you're supposed to go make it look like that page. And then if that happens, it wouldn't be all that uncommon for you to get another Photoshop mock-up of a page later that is actually the same template, the same thing, but there are subtle variations there. So if you instead focus on defining the template, and a page is just an instance of a template that has content plugged into it, you should be able to avoid some of that rework. And it also allows you to even just kind of have that conversation, like, hey, I thought this was the detail page template, but there's some things in this mockup that make it different. Is that intentional? Stuff like that. But anyway, having these modular, reusable pieces, I think is a good practice, but also kind of important to building this framework that you can use to protect yourself as you develop your theme. The living style guide should also use real-world CSS and markup. So we'll look at some examples of this up on its feet. Using the real-world CSS actually turns out to not be all that hard, given some of the tools that we have here. The markup, it can be a little bit more challenging, although we'll also hopefully have some time to talk about, there's been some efforts in the Drupal community lately to try to bridge that gap so that the markup that Drupal's looking at can be the same markup that your style guide is looking at, and you don't have to be maintaining two sets of things, in theory. It should always be kept up to date. So what this means is that your style guide should be, part of your workflow and generated automatically. You'll still have to add the documentation in your SMACSS, for example. It's not truly magic, but as long as you're keeping up with that documentation, the style guide should be updating itself anytime that there is a change. And then also, as we're leading towards, this gives you a framework that is testable. So, get to the Drupal part already. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the things that exist in Drupal 8 that I think help here. So using and theming in Drupal 8, my experience so far has been pretty pleasant and exciting, and I feel like Drupal 8 wants you to build better themes, which is wonderful. So a few things that help you do that. There's definitely been a lot of effort and attention to make the markup that Drupal 8 generates a little bit cleaner. than before, which was not necessarily that at all. And there are a couple of base themes, classy and stable. Classy to me is kind of like the sane, reasonable amount of markup. And stable is the kind of bare minimum. And so you can use these as base themes when you build custom themes. You have to define a base theme. So if you don't, it'll default to, I believe, stable, unless you put in your theme info YAML file base theme equals false. But you should be using a base theme. And then in general, kind of at a high level, there's a much clearer separation between logic and display, which helps in a wide variety of ways. But one simple example is back in the Drupal 7 days, it'd be really common that to do something like add a class into your markup, you might have to do some pre-processing to add that or create a custom template that gets picked up. But there's certain pieces of logic that you can use in your Twig templates now to do things like add classes and set them. Or even below, there's an example of checking to see if a class exists and rendering different variations of markup based on that. So there should be less digging into, PHP stuff to find out where some of this stuff is coming from, and more of this should be in the templates and easier for a themer to find. So on the topic of creating modular reusable components, there's the CSS coding standards that are followed in Drupal 8. And none of this is really specific to Drupal 8, but it's nice that it's being used. So there's SMACSS, which is an approach to organizing your partials. So this is just a screenshot of folder layout in the 7 theme in core. There's they're broken down into a bunch of different folders. There's the base folder, which has base HTML elements, things like a reset style sheet. There's layout, which is how things are laid out, obviously, on your site. Things like your grid system would go in there. And then there's the components, which are the individual components on your site. SMACSS calls those modules, but I think there's something else in Drupal called a module. I can't quite remember what it is. So we'll refer to it as component. Then there's also state and theme. I find when we look at the next thing, the BEM naming convention, it makes those, a little less important. I find myself relying on those and dividing those out less and doing more in the component. So BEM is a naming convention for components, stands for block element modifier. So the block is the component, the unique component. An element is something within that component, and then a modifier modifies either the element or the block. And here's the naming convention for that. Double underscore before an element, double hyphen for a modifier, and then you could have something like block, double underscore element, double hyphen modifier. And so here, this is just a screenshot, again, from 7 of some of those naming conventions being used. So here, the block is a pager item. And then we see that there's, the block is the pager. The pager item is the element. And then there's the modifiers for pager item, next, last, first, and previous. So one last little trick that's pretty useful from the perspective of trying to make the things that you build more easily reusable is the idea of extending Twig templates. So this is an example of the default field.html.twig template. And thinking back to how this would be done in Drupal 7, if you wanted to, say, wrap the content here, the content items in different markup, like an H1 or something, what you would have to do in Drupal 7 is create a duplicate of this template. If you want to do this in the template, you'd have to create a duplicate of this template that contains the entire contents of field.html.twig. Make your change there. And then if you had another one that needed to be in H2, you'd have to do the same thing over. So if we instead wanted to try to use the extends approach to make this change, we'd take field.html.twig and create a custom version of that in our theme. And we use the block here to wrap the things that we want to change. So you say block, and you give it a name, and then endBlock closes out the block. In case, depending on there were multiple results or single results, I created different blocks for each of those in this case. But you define the blocks in that field.html twig that becomes the field.html twig that your theme uses. And then if we wanted to create a specific field template that just wraps the content in H1s, what we would do is we would say that we're extending field.html.twig, and then we just redefine the things that we want to change. So we redefine the blocks, wrap them in H1s, and you're done. So there's a bunch of different variations on that I think can be used to help you reuse things a little bit better and repeat yourself less, which is awesome. Okay. So on to creating your style guide. So again, there's a bunch of different ways that this can be done. One thing, looking back to Drupal 7, this is a Drupal 7 little video here, but this is the style guide module. I imagine that many of you guys have tried this out, but worth mentioning for anybody who hasn't. It's just a module that you can enable that will show you common markup and Drupal components and what they look like in your theme, all laid out in one big page here. And you can also switch between your themes to see what all those things look like. So that's a quick, simple way that you can see some of these things up on your feet. It's good to see kind of how far along you've got in a theme, if maybe you've missed things, stuff like that. It's also got a handful of cool hooks that you can use to either put in your own custom components or modify the ones that are rendered by Style Guide. There is a port of the Style Guide module for Drupal 8 that's in progress. I haven't checked in a few weeks, but I believe it's still in progress. I should double check that. However, even whether or not there is the Style Guide module, I've also kind of moved on to using Style Guide generators to build the Style Guide. So we'll look at a few examples of that. So there's a bunch of different options. One that's pretty common and popular in the Drupal community is Pattern Lab, and that's tied into that atomic design concept that we talked about before. Pattern Lab is really great at allowing you to reuse and embed components inside of other components, which is great. It's been a little while at this point, but when I first tried to use Pattern Lab with Drupal, I found it was a little bit difficult for those things to play nice, for me anyway. But I know a lot of people in the Drupal community use it, and I know that there's been some attention recently on trying to get those to play together better. So I definitely want to revisit that, and I expect that you might have better luck than I did a while ago. Another one that I heard commonly is Hologram, which is a Ruby gem. I believe it's pretty similar to KSS, and KSS is a style guide generator that I've been using most frequently. KSS stands for Nile Style Sheets, so it uses just a human-readable documentation syntax that you provide in your CSS files. It works with nicely with any flavor of CSS, so it can be your vanilla CSS, your Sass. There's a bunch of different implementations of it, including a Node.js implementation, which is what I use. It has a nice grunt plugin, so you can work it into your build process really easily. Also, it recently started supporting Twig as well for the markup, which is nice. And one of the co-maintainers for the Node.js implementation is John Albin, who also maintains the Zen theme. So there's a nice little kind of Drupal world overlap there, which is cool. So installing it, when I gave this presentation once previously, Morten DK, who if you know him, is a very loud, opinionated gentleman, was sitting in the front row and took the opportunity to tell me that there is a Drupal module for this, which is true, but I think it needs some work and contributions to be as useful as it can be. So right now, there is a module for it, but it's the node package. But here's how you would install it. You would install KSS, and then if you want to use the Grunt plugin for it, you would install that as well. So let's take a quick look at an example and what this would look like. So this is the solution section on the Breakthrough Technologies website. So we have, these are teasers for taxonomy terms. There's a little thumbnail, and then a title, which is an H4, and then some text. So if we wanted to document that and include it in the style guide, this is what that could look like. So you're just providing comments that are above the related rule in your SASS file in this case. So the first line is just giving it a name. Then below that, you can give it a description that's going to be included in the style guide. For the markup, you can specify a location where the markup snippet lives. That can be in HTML format, handlebars format, or twig. And you can also provide markup inline, but that gets kind of unwieldy kind of fast. If it was something really simple, you could do that. And then the style guide section down at the bottom specifies where in the style guide that shows up. So what section it's going to be part of and what it's going to be named. So you do that, and then you can build your style guide. So if you're using the Grunt plugin, you can run Grunt KSS, or you can have it be part of your default Grunt watch tasks, so that anytime your SASS or your twig templates change or something, it'll automatically regenerate your style guide. Or if you're going to run it individually, this is what the command looks like, and it's helpful to break down what goes into this. So it's KSS node, and then for the source, you're passing in the location of the CSS files that it's going to read through to generate your style guide. So in this case, it's just my SASS directory. The destination is where the style guide is going to be generated. So here I'm just saying create it in a style guide directory that's in the theme. So I actually build out the style guide as part of the theme. And then the CSS flag specifies a CSS file that you're including in your style guide. So that's an easy way that you can make sure that the same CSS that's being used for Drupal is being used for your style guide. So you do all that, and here's an example of what it can look like. So here we see our solution teaser component, the description that we set up. The component is rendered there, and then we see the markup below that you should be able to use to generate something that looks like this. Okay. So quickly, let's take a look at an example, just so we can see how all this comes together. They always say, be sure to do live demos. So that's what we're going to do. Maybe I misheard that. I'm not sure. All right, so here's the Breakthrough Technologies website. This is the solutions section. So let's say, just for a simple, obvious example, that we decided we wanted to make the titles big and red. So we'll get Grunt going here, so it's watching for changes. This is just a partial that has documented section for our H4 tags. Big and red for D4D. And then we'll make it big and red.
But 10 pixels does. So yes, I do know better, but I'm working with the bugs that I have, okay?
Oops.
So 10 pixels is our grid gap, and I've also put a margin on this of 1%. Okay, then the next thing that I'm going to do...
Okay, so we made that change, and Grunt is doing its work here. So it rebuilt the CSS from our SASS, and it also rebuilt the style guide. So it went through all of the source and built all the files that it needs to build, completed, and then we cleared our cache as well. So now, if we look at the site, we should see things that are big and red.
1, 2, 3, 4 columns, but the space in
Haha, perfect, fantastic. Let's ship it. And then if we go over to the style guide and look at the heading section, we'll see that the H4 section is now big and red, and it's big and red for design for Drupal. So, super simple example of that up on its feet there. All right. Okay, so now, if we're following that approach, we have a nice framework that we can use to test. We have this style guide, we've defined our components, we know the things that we're trying to make sure aren't changing on our site, so we can test it. So there's, again, a number of ways that you can try to cover some of this stuff. At Breakthrough, we do a lot of BHAT testing, which is a behavior-driven development framework that some of you might be familiar with. So I found pretty quickly, while BHAT is awesome, it isn't really well suited to doing this basically to covering kind of the visual elements of your site. We've created some custom steps to try to cover some of that, but pretty quickly it became apparent this really isn't the right place for it. So we have a step that simulates different device widths, and then the bulk of the ones below test computed CSS values for a particular selector, which useful to have, but if you're taking this approach, you'll find that you have to kind of rewrite most of your CSS rules to be able to test them. And because it's the computed value, it can drift pretty easily if there's a page that has, does or doesn't have a scroll bar in certain scenarios. So it might be a useful trick to have. There's a link in the slides to a gist that has some of the details of these steps if anybody's curious. But I found that BHAT really wasn't the right home for this sort of coverage. But thankfully, there's a bunch of other tools to do this. One of them is Wraith, which is a screenshot comparison tool developed by the team at the BBC. And this is another one that I used a little while back, and at the time it didn't quite do what I was looking for it to do. But I think it's evolved a lot since then. When I used it, it was mainly kind of focused around comparing two live URLs. It was because you just basically say, look at these two sites. Pretty easy to get up and running and configure. By default, it takes like all or nothing screenshot comparison diffs, which is really good for being able to give you an overall indication like, oh, wait a minute, something changed, and I didn't expect it to. But I find those to be a little bit less useful, especially if you're following this process and have well-defined components on your site. In that, like if there's a diff up towards the top of the page, like you see here, it's really common for everything below it to be a diff as well, so it can obscure other failures and make it a little harder to track down what actually changed. But if you're like just looking for an indication that something went bad, maybe even after like an upgrade or something, it can be a good tool. And also, I think that there have been some changes with it lately that makes it better at testing against an existing baseline and also targeting individual components on your site rather than doing a full page comparison. So another thing I hope to spend some more time looking back at. It does create a nice little screenshot results report, which is nice. So here you see all the two screenshots in the diff, and you can scroll through it. So in between, I spent some time for a while using Phantom CSS, which is another way to do that sort of screenshot comparisons. That had been like not maintained for a while, and talking to people at DrupalCon, I heard a lot of people using WebDriver IO, which has a lot of the same strengths. So this is what I've been using lately. And WebDriver IO is a set of Selenium bindings for Node.js. So Selenium handles browser automation. WebDriver IO is a Node library that drives Selenium. And then WebDriver CSS handles that screenshot comparison testing that we've looked at. So what's great about this is that it's really easy to script in some amount of interactivity into your tests, and it's a lot easier to target individual components. So we can look at what that would look like. First, the install. So it's a series of NPM packages, I find that a lot of these things, especially in the visual regression testing, tend to move pretty fast and change a lot. So here, there's a particular set of versions that work together best right now. Hopefully, they'll get a little bit easier to manage in the future. And then after you've installed WebDriver IO, WebDriver CSS, and Selenium Standalone, you need to install Selenium Standalone so you can run that. So looking at actually creating a test. So it's a JavaScript file. And we can just go through at a high level what's in here. So first you need to require the things you're going to depend on. So you require WebDriver IO and WebDriver CSS. And then if you want to have your test fail, if there's a diff, you need some sort of assertion library. So then the set of options there are passed into your, when you create your WebDriver IO browser. Here we're just specifying the browser that we want to use. It can work with Chrome, Safari, Firefox, and Phantom.js. And the cool thing about the fact that it works with Phantom.js as well is that that's a headless browser. So it's nice for being able to run the tests as part of like a continuous integration process. Then you can also pass in options for WebDriver CSS as far as where the screenshots are being saved. And then at the bottom here, this is just a function that handles the assertion for the screenshots. It's something that I got out of a gist that was included in some documentation on this process. But it basically just iterates through all of the screenshots, compares the new one to the baseline, and raises an exception if it's different within a particular mismatch tolerance. So then like the actual meat of the test, once you've got that stuff set up, so specify the URL that you want to look at, and you can change that throughout the course of your test. What typically I think you'd want to do here is make that something that's a little bit more easily configurable. If you have different developers working in the code base with different local environments that might be called different things. But that's there for the sake of example. And then the WebDriver CSS steps that are chained here. So it defines like a group of screenshots that are taken. And then the name is what the screenshot is going to be named as. So I'm naming it after the component in this case. And then the element there is the selector that it's going to use when it takes the screenshot. So it's just going to take a screenshot of that selector. And then there's a callback to insert the screenshots. And then the second example just shows a really simple example of having some interactivity. So one thing that we have on the site here is in some off-canvas navigation. So if you want to be able to capture a screenshot of that, first you've got to click it. So we just specify the element that we're going to click on. It'll simulate a click on it so that the off-canvas menu is exposed, and then we can take a screenshot of that as well. So if we do that, we would get a screenshot that looks like below. So let's also take a quick look at what that looks like up on its feet. Okay. All right, so we have our site, and again, it's nice, ugly, big and red here. So let's get Selenium running. And then we'll run our test. It's the same test that we looked at before here. I cleared out the screenshots folder. So this is, I just want to show you guys what'll happen on our first run.
And then keep waiting for CSS4 grid. Yay!
So we run it. It actually, I'm having it use Chrome here for the sake of example, so it actually pops up Chrome. Yeah. And what WebDriver IO does is it actually takes like a full page screenshot of the page that you're testing, and then goes and cuts out the individual components based on selector, which is a little weird, but gives you the same results that I would expect here. So we've got our solution teaser component here, and took a screenshot of it, and it's big and red. like we would expect. So now let's say that we came to our senses and decided, you know what, those shouldn't be big and red anymore. That was a mistake. Just a Saturday morning thing. So we'll go and back out that change and remove our change to documentation, save that. So now Grunt's going out and it's rebuilding the CSS, rebuilding the style guide, clearing the cache. So in a second, we should be able to go take a look and see that things are back to normal. H4 looks normal. And if we go back to the site.
Welcome to Microsoft Art Center. Any other questions?
Eventually, we'll see that things are no longer big and red. Hooray. So now, if we run our test again, we would obviously expect one of them to fail. So hopefully in live demo world that happens.
Yes.
And it looks like it did. So now we see for the solution teaser, which is the thing that changed, we have the baseline screenshot. So that would be the thing that you would have checked into your code base that people are comparing against. And so actually, we see here that it says that there's a mismatch tolerance exceeded and a diff created. So here there's a screenshot of the regression. So that's what things look like now on the version of the site that we're testing. And then in the diff directory, we see for the solution teaser component a diff image that has the old and the new overlaid on top of each other, and you see the diff. So exactly what you would expect there. So if you are following this process and have defined components in your style guide, and you have tests covering them, it's really easy to see where something might have slipped up and changed, and kind of track down exactly what changed, where the cause was, and also what was impacted by it, which is pretty great. A lot better than the alternative, anyway. Okay, so some, go away, top bar. No? Cool. So some challenges with this process. One, as I mentioned, the tools for this continue to evolve quite a bit. So, I kind of got to stay up on where things are at, what needs to be upgraded, what's, kind of the best approach for this workflow. A question that I've always asked myself along the way, and we'll dive into this a little bit more, is like, what should you actually be testing? Should you be testing the site itself? Should you be testing your style guide? Is it some combination of those two things? And then there's also that whole idea of sharing markup between Drupal and the style guide. So let's actually dig into that last one a little bit more. We have a little bit of time, I think, although I really have no idea what the schedule is actually at now. So in DrupalCon New Orleans during the Dries note, there were a number of key initiatives that were outlined, and one of them, the number one for theming, and the front end was the component-based rendering initiative. So there's a lot that kind of wraps up into that, but really, at the end of the day, from my perspective, what the community is trying to do is make it easier to build these component-based systems, atomic design kind of influenced approaches to theming in Drupal, which is really, really awesome. And also, as kind of a side effect of that, people are looking at ways that we can get Drupal to play more nicely with style guides. So anyway, there's a link to the issue that is kind of the main issue for the initiative. There's a Drupal Twig Slack that has a components channel. There's a lot of discussion on this topic. So much discussion that it is very difficult to keep up. And weekly meetings. They seem to be more than weekly. Yeah, but yeah, frequent meetings. A lot of good stuff going on. So there's been a couple of different approaches to that whole make Drupal share the markup with your style guide. There was a session in DrupalCon New Orleans about Drupal working with Pattern Lab, and they have a particular approach to having Pattern Lab use the same markup as Drupal. The one that I've played around with the most is the approach that's used in the Zen theme, unsurprisingly, because John Albin maintains KSS, so it already is in line with some of the things that I'm working with. But some of the concepts here are pretty similar in that, so the current Zen theme for 8 has examples of this, but the basic approach uses a model view presenter approach. And oversimplifying it, but like at a high level, the presenter kind of stands in the middle between Drupal and your style guides to do some translation, either kind of queuing up the things that that Drupal that the style guide needs to know from Drupal, or handling the things that maybe your style guide doesn't know about that are like Drupal specific twig functions or things like that. The Zen theme has examples of this. I've also played around with trying to get this going myself as well. Here's just a screenshot that kind of shows at a high level a little bit of what this looks like. So in a custom theme here, the templates directory where Drupal would typically look for its template, in this case just a field template for a quote field, that's where it's going to look first, and that is essentially functions as the presenter. So we're queuing up all the Drupal-y things and handling all the Drupal-y things there. And then we're including the component, which lives in its own components folder. And the idea is that the twig component there is basically just vanilla twig. To be able to take that approach to including requires the use of a components module that right now I think really all it does is allow you to use a custom twig namespace. Perhaps in the future it will do more than that because it's the components module. So taking this approach, and so this is an example of what the actual component twig template looks like. So it's more default vanilla twig here. And the idea is that in the component, the quote component, you're including all of the individual pieces that the component needs to function. So the CSS, you could have JavaScript in there. The quote.json actually is just content that feeds into the KSS style guide. You'd include that as a library. But anyway, it's just a packaged piece that can live on its own and be reused. Let's see how much time we have here. Still not sure exactly. All right. 5 minutes?
I think if we're half an hour off, we should be wrapping up at 11:20.
Okay, cool. All right, so in that case, so I could... does anybody want to see just an example? I mean, it's really just demonstrating that that works. Or would people rather ask some questions? All right, awesome.
So one of the problems that I've run into is that Drupal has a bunch of twig extensions.
Yep.
And so that's been kind of a challenge with getting that content into the KSS node, like translate. Do you have, what have you done to deal with that sort of thing, or have you come up with that?
Yeah, so the recent versions of KSS, for example, actually have some handling for that. So they basically look for those Drupal-specific extensions, and if they see it, they don't freak out as hard as they did before. I mean, essentially, I'd imagine they're probably just ignoring them.
Yeah, it was actually crashing.
Yep. Yeah, it doesn't do that anymore, which is nice. This slide, thinking about the idea of like what you should be testing, this is kind of thinking forward to a future state where we're doing more to have the style guide and Drupal share the same markup. It feels to me like what we'd want to do in that case is we could have like really full coverage in the style guide of the actual components and styles. And then the site would be covering like either a high-level coverage or kind of more strategic elements that we want to make sure aren't changing on the site itself. And that allows you to use the full coverage on the style guide is obviously a little bit more predictable than the site itself. Any other questions or comments or anything? Yep.
What frequency do you find yourself running these regression tests?
Yeah, so I mean that can all vary depending on how long the test suite takes to run, but at least the idea is that there should be, if you add something new, there should be some test coverage, and if you commit a change, you should run the test suite.
Right. I think that's been the biggest thing I've struggled with. Is ideally, it's kind of one of them that as you're developing and pulling stuff out.
Yep.
Because these tests take a little bit of time, you know, the next best thing is probably putting that on your server so you can push your changes up there. That's what we run on the heavy sites.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And that would definitely be the ideal workflow, and the fact that WebDriver IO can use a headless browser. Yeah, having that part of your CI process where if you merge to a development branch, it runs on the integration server, runs this test suite, that would definitely be ideal. Yep. Yes?
I first want to say that I've looked at a number of ways to do this, and this really looks straightforward and clean implementation. I really love it.
Cool.
But then my question is, like, where in your project pipeline does this come in? Like, do you have to start your Drupal project and then you do your style guide, or because it seems like that's a little bit out of order. You know, like how do you build Drupal unless you have your design, your styles established?
Yep. Yeah, so it's a good question. Yeah, the kind of end home for this would, I think it's nice to have it live in the Drupal project, but because KSS can just look at any sort of CSS, it could live outside of the Drupal project when the Drupal project doesn't exist, and then migrate into it when that can happen. That's my best guess anyway.
So are you using this on projects?
I am, but I will admit that I often, either when the Drupal development has started, I'm the one who initializes creating the style guide, or it's something that kind of going back and building after the fact. So, my dirty secret. Any other questions or anything?
I was just going to point out that, so it seems like Zen is a nice place to start if you're interested in KSS and like how a theme and the style guide can be integrated. There's also one for Pattern Lab that phase 2 has built integrates the new Pattern Lab, which works with Twig.
Yep.
Called the Pattern Lab Starter theme.
Yep. Yeah, and I was also looking at I think Pattern Lab just recently released the version 2. And actually, even on the Pattern Lab site, they have like a Drupal version on the main downloads page. And I don't know it's the same thing as the phase 2 thing, so I was trying to figure out even what the difference is.
Yeah, I thought they were working directly together, so it may be the same thing.
Yeah, I also may just be confused, and then I haven't really been hands-on with it. So, but yeah, there's definitely a lot of work to do similar things in Pattern Lab, and but just also Drupal as a whole being able to handle this type of workflow better, which is really, really great. Cool. All right. Well, thanks everybody, and I'll be around if you want to talk about this stuff more. So, thanks.